Everybody, welcome back to the How to Podcast series. This is the show where we get to talk to great podcasters through their journey as a podcaster. You get to meet and be introduced to some great shows. This podcast that we're going to talk about today keeps me company at work, which is great. In that late 3 o'clock in the morning time, I'm listening to John's show and I really enjoy it. He's got some amazing guests, great stories. He's a great host. So you're going to learn a lot from him. John's on the show today, and we're going to talk podcasting and business as well. So, hey, John, welcome to the How to Podcast series as my guest co-host. Glad to have you here.
David, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be on your show today. We met through Podmatch, and it was the first time that I've been connected with anyone through Podmatch. So, just glad to be here.
Good. Awesome. And shout out to Alex and the team at Podmatch.
Sure thing.
Thank you for making this happen. John, tell everybody about your show.
Yeah, so I host actually two podcasts. I host Podcasting and Professional Services, which is the one that you mentioned, and that is I feature hosts of other business podcasters who are a few steps ahead of where I am. These are hosts of podcasts of businesses that serve accounting and financial services. They serve engineering services, architecture services, consulting services. So they're very much professional services firms with a podcast. So those are the kinds of shows that I feature on my show, and I try to kind of understand, why the decision to launch a podcast, what is the business impact of the show on your business, and then we'll take the conversation from there and we can explore a bunch of different topics. But that's that show. The other show is Breaking Biz Dev, and my co-host Mark and I, we beat up and break down topics related to business development for professional services firms. So 2 shows, same audience. That's what I'm into.
Excellent. And then tell us more about Red Cedar as well.
Sure. Yeah. Red Cedar. It happened as I was laid off in 22, and I went out on my own as a solo marketing consultant, and I realized that I needed to niche down in terms of my service offering, in terms of my target audience. So I am a professional, or I am a podcast marketing company for professional services firms. And so I'm growing a team. I've got a book of, about 10 or so shows in my portfolio now. So it's a growing company, but really excited to where we're headed.
Excellent. That's amazing. All right. So the whole business side of podcasting, John, like for somebody who has a business and they've been throwing all their marketing money into like bus benches, art, signs on a bus, radio spots where maybe somebody listens. We're not really sure. They buy all this stuff. They put the mailers. They come to your house.
Sure.
They go immediately into the recycle bin.
Yeah.
They spend all this money on marketing. But the idea of using podcast as a marketing arm for your business, is that something that businesses just haven't caught up to yet, or they're getting there? Like what's the temperature around podcasting as a marketing arm for your business?
Yeah, well, I think that it's a match made in heaven for professional services firms, because these professional services firms, we're talking about law firms, tax firms, engineering firms, they're built on the expertise of their practitioners. And in many cases, these firms organize themselves into a doer-seller business development model. So they'll have architects who are responsible for their own book of business and winning new deals and contributing to proposals and pitches and things like that. And so a podcast within that environment is a way to give these experts more of a voice, more of a platform. It's also a way to build trust with your audience. So in this world, in these industries, trust is at a premium because business development is all about relationships. We're talking about high dollar transactions. And so there needs to be a certain amount of trust built up over the sales process for those transactions to happen. And a podcast is a great way to build trust at scale. And so that's one of the reasons why I'm so bullish on podcasting in the professional services industries.
I got to find out the story from you. Like, how did podcasting find you? We always kind of ask, how did you find podcasting? But how did podcasting find you?
Oh, I love this question. And what I found is many podcasters started out as podcast listeners. They listen to podcasts, and I'm no exception. So I was working at a marketing agency, in Reston, Virginia, which is just outside of Washington, D.C. And I had a 90-minute commute to the office and a 90-minute commute back home.
Wow.
And so I was listening to a bunch of sports podcasts. I'm a big Redskins fan. And so I listened to a bunch of sports podcasts, and then I ran out of content to listen to. And so I was like, okay, well, in the morning, one morning I said, well, let's put on let's look up a marketing podcast. And so I found two Bobs. And then I found like the B2B growth show. And then I found a whole other, suite of shows focused on B2B, professional services, business. And then I thought to myself, wow, what if we created a podcast for the agency? And then a few months later, my colleague Kelly Waffle and we launched the Visible Expert podcast. And we interviewed folks about their journey in professional services, going from relatively unknown to a well-known name in the industry. And that was a really fun ride. But that was my foray into podcasting.
Nice. And so is that kind of where you learned how to podcast as well then?
Yeah, I grew up playing music as a kid.
Ooh.
So my mom had a drum kit and my neighbor got a guitar, and I was about like 10 years old or something. And we just started jamming in the basement. And then one Christmas I got like this little MP3 player, and it had like a voice record thing on it. And so I like put it in like way back in the other room because like I needed to dampen the sound. It was just like, that's how I got into recording. And then from there, like in high school, I was in bands and stuff, and we would just like, I learned how to like rig up mics on a drum kit to make it sound good. So that's kind of how I got into like audio recording. And then that day in the car when I was listening to the podcast and I had that idea, I kind of mixed the audio recording experience with my marketing experience, and that's how I kind of got into it and just kind of figured it all out.
That's a great combo. I have a similar path for myself. Music has been a big part of my life, and I have all the gear, everything here. Band practice is over, everybody goes home, and I'm like, what is this podcasting? I honestly didn't know if I was going to like it. The idea of somebody talking to me in my ears instead of music. I always listen to music, but I'm going to take a chance on this podcast thing. I'm going to press play. I'm not really sure. I'm not really sold on it. And I fell in love with it. Just the fact that there's so many amazing types of podcasts out there that you can find a podcast about anything.
Oh gosh,
really,
I know.
It's amazing.
Yeah. What instrument do you play?
I play guitar, bass, drums, and piano.
Okay. So you're like me. I like to hop on the different instruments, It's like musical chairs a little bit. Like when my band mates get together, we're like, okay, let's pause, everyone rotate to an instrument to the left.
I love when a band can all switch places and everybody plays something different. That's so cool to watch.
Yeah.
That's fun. Okay, so it's 2025 when we're recording this, second day into the year. I'm kind of curious about what your podcast goal is for you personally as we look into this new year. Do you have like a goal, like kind of a big picture for yourself and your podcast that you could share with us?
Well, I haven't thought about any big picture goals because my goal has always been to get 1% better with every episode. And so whether that's me as a host trying not to say too many filler words or asking better questions, or even if it's on the post-production side, how can I make the video aspect better? Or how could I make the editing process smoother? Or can I streamline the production process? Or is there a way that I can cut time? Or, what are the areas that I need to lean into more? So with every episode, I try to find one tiny aspect that I can experiment and try to improve on. And if I can just do that over the course of the year, the podcasts that I produce in December 25 are going to be much better than the podcasts that I produced, December 24. So that's the way that I look at it.
Yeah, that incremental growth, episode to episode, I think that's really amazing. That's something to focus on instead of your stats. Hyper-focused on stats, should be really hyper-focused on getting better in every episode. I love that.
Yeah, the stats.
For me, I'm looking at 2025 being kind of a collection of people for me, as many people as I can meet as possible.
I like that.
And just building community around podcasting so that I'm not in my basement by myself, talking to a microphone, meeting great people like you, and having a chance to have time in your calendar. That's what I want to do more of in 2025 is just build as many bridges as I can.
Yeah. And how are you measuring that? Is it just like the total number of episodes that you put out or the number of connections that you make on LinkedIn, or how are you measuring that?
I think for me, it's about the episodes, but it's also the other beautiful thing is it's interesting. I'll meet somebody like you, John, and then I'll have somebody come on and they have a business podcast. And I'm like, have you met John? And they're like, no, I haven't met John. So I'm like, so behind the scenes, I'm doing the email,
Yeah.
collaboration emails. Say, hey, John, here's so and so, here's John. You two need to talk to each other. And then I get out of the way. I love doing that too, because now that's a new relationship that's happening. And it's like beyond me at that point, where you and someone else that I can connect the two of you together. You go off on your path and I may never know the result, but I get to do that as well. And I just love building and being that connector behind the scenes. Kind of like the old school, for people who are really old, the telephone person would actually physically connect you and put you on a switchboard from one place to the next. I feel like I'm a switchboard operator, kind of making these connections happen behind the scenes in real time.
That's really cool. It's like I've heard it referred to as a value triangle, where
Ooh,
you're providing value not just to these people, but they're finding value from their relationship with you too, because you made this connection. So there's this like value triangle that happens when you make a referral like that. And then there's also the
interesting.
karmic benefits too, right? Like you get back what you put out into the world.
And it kind of goes back to somebody asked me a question a long time ago. They said, if you were to step out of the room and it's a room full of your community, friends, family, past podcast guests, people you've connected with over the years, and you were to remove yourself from the room, what would you want them to say about
Right.
you when you're outside in the hallway? Right. So it's not so morbid as you're going to be gone, but you're just outside in the hallway and people have the freedom to talk about you without you around. What do you want them to say? And for me, that was what came back to me is I want to be known as a collector of people.
Hmm.
It's kind of my goal for 2025. I want to collect as many people as possible and use podcasting as a way. And again, making those connections behind the scene. I just think that's kind of what I want to be known for this year.
Well, that's an important part of building your personal brand too. I worked at a branding agency, and one of the kind of like mathematical equations we came up with was your brand strength is the product of your reputation and your visibility. And so, if you could quantify your reputation and then you could quantify your visibility relatively in the market, you could calculate your brand strength relative to other companies like you. So what you're talking about is an important part of that equation is, what do people say about you behind closed doors? That's your reputation. And then
Right.
how well known you are, that's your visibility. So those two are distinctly different, but two important parts of your personal brand.
And that word of mouth, people talking about you when you're not even there, unprompted. Um, like for me, I love promoting Mel Robbins because I just love listening to her show. I like how she podcasts. She's a great example of a great podcast. She really includes her listener. So here we are talking about Mel Robbins. She didn't even prompt this, but here I am talking about her show because I really like it. That's really the one thing I'd love for podcasters to dig deep on is be noteworthy enough for people to talk about you when you're not even there.
That's right.
You go, oh my gosh, John's podcast is amazing. You got to go check it out. Link in the show notes. You got to go check him out. Both of his shows are great. You got to go check them out. Like, I love that happening and you're not even there. And I think as podcasters, if we can create great content, show up and be accountable and be somebody that people can rely on, that we're going to keep showing up with our great content, that people are going to naturally just talk about us because they can see the heart behind what we do.
Hmm. And you mentioned earlier about how you can find a topic about anything, a podcast about any topic. And I think because of that kind of like decentralized notion of media and how podcasts are becoming like the new media, this new wave of media, you can see that in the total demand for podcasts just continues to grow month over month. That these folks are super passionate about the niches that they decided to create a podcast around. I mean, you've got
Right.
podcasts around architecture and you've got podcasts around legal stuff. I mean, like there are people who are avid listeners of that. And it's not everyone's cup of tea, but the people who it is their cup of tea, that's their bag, man. So I love podcasts.
So, okay, what are you kind of, I'm curious about this. Is there anything in the podcasting world when you hear somebody bring this certain thing up. You've tried it and maybe it just hasn't worked for you in the past, or you haven't had the same results that maybe other people have had, and you've kind of decided not to follow that maybe popular opinion around podcasting or how to podcast. Is there anything you kind of just went, it didn't really work for me and I'm going to go in a new direction?
Yeah, and I am a huge proponent of content repurposing. And content repurposing is this term. And what it means is you take one form of content, let's say a podcast episode, and you take the transcript and turn it into a blog post, or you turn it into a newsletter edition, or you turn it into a series of text posts. And in theory, it's yes, those are absolutely ways that you can amplify the visibility of your episode, of your brand. You can extend the reach of your content. However, there is a cost of producing all of those assets, of investing both either time or dollars into the creation of those assets. And so for me, what I was finding was I wanted to showcase that notion with each episode of my podcast, Podcasting and Professional Services. I would create a blog post for every episode. And what I was finding is as my business was growing and my book of accounts was growing, I was really, really strapped for time. So the 4 or 5 hours it took to create a blog post that was up to my standards, that it didn't sound like it was written by AI, it included links, all the research was right, pulled the quotes out. It wasn't worth my time at that point. And so I pruned that out of my strategy.
Really?
And it was liberating. Like I felt like a weight was lifted off my shoulders. Now I don't have to do that. I'm not burdened by the blog post for every episode. Now I do offer that for clients, sure. But for me in my situation as a solo business owner, I just couldn't devote the time every week to writing a blog post of that caliber. So I cut that out, and it's worked really well. It's freed up, like I said, 4 or 5 hours a week for me. And that's time that I can devote to my clients. It's time that I can devote to, building out my team. It's time that I can devote to working on the business, not in the business. So that would be an example of, something that would grow visibility, but it's just the opportunity cost wasn't worth it.
So then what's one thing counter to that you're all in on for 2025? I'm not going to take this off my plate. It's a must have for podcasting for my show or the shows I help with.
That's a good question. I think social media is probably the biggest, outside of word of mouth. I think there's research from the podcast hosts that supports this.
Yep.
Social media is the number one discovery platform for podcasts. So I think short video clips from podcast episodes are probably like the top of the pile when it comes to how to promote podcast episodes. That and email, I think. But those video clips on social, because the podcast listeners in the business world, podcast listeners float in and out of shows. There's a subset of your listeners that are dedicated to listen to every single episode, but the majority, from what I've found, will float in and out, and they'll listen based on the topic of the episode. So if you're able to capture the key moments from specific episodes, those key topics, and you're able to show those highlights on social media, that's a way to funnel users into listening to an episode. Maybe you've got a guest that makes a really solid point, and you tease the listener with that video on leave them wanting to listen to more of what that guest has to say. I think that's, like, in my mind, a non-negotiable for if you want to grow your show. That's something that you absolutely have to do.
So that's so what you just did there would be the clip for this show right there. Because you just did exactly what, great example. Okay, so the whole debate we hear in podcasting right now is the audio, video,
Yeah.
back and forth. Do we need both? Can we survive with just audio? Can we survive with a video first format? Kind of for a new podcaster listening who doesn't maybe have all the tech skills that you have, and the kind of the bandwidth and the tools and the cameras and all that stuff. They're just starting out. They're a little overwhelmed that they have to do everything. Do you have any words of wisdom to a brand new podcaster listening on where the starting point would be for somebody with maybe less tech ability than maybe you might have?
Yeah, I am not. I used to be of the mind where video was the way to start, but as I've kind of matured in my own podcasting journey, what I've found is that maybe it doesn't make sense to always have a video component for your show. I'll give you an example. I'm working with an architecture firm, and they have a podcast called Signal Radio. And if you're into architecture, go check it out because what Mark does really well is he's an architect himself. He's also a musician, so he has like
Oh,
the music background and like the understanding of audio recording. So he records his conversations with teaming partners, clients, people who he's worked on designing a space for, and they record the episode in that space. And so they're able to capture the energy, they're able to capture the mood of
yeah.
the space, they're able to capture the ambient noises in the background. And it works for him because that's his business, is designing spaces for community. And so I thought that was really interesting. And what I recommended that we consider more video, and he pushed back on me, and he was like, John, I think this is more about kind of capturing the conversation in the space. And we do use video to help promote the show with, B-roll footage of the space, kind of showing the visual component of it. But the conversation is audio only. And it makes for a more intimate experience with the guest because their defenses are lower. You're not on video, so it's more casual. So I think that there can be an argument made for going the audio only route. Certainly there's an argument for video, and I'm happy to get into kind of like the pros and cons if you'd like.
Yeah, let's do that.
Yeah, well, we mentioned it earlier. Video snippets for social media is one of the best ways to grow a podcast. And you can certainly do that if you have like an audio show and you go the audiogram route and have like a headshot and like a waveform, and there's tools like Headliner that can do that for you. But there's nothing that replaces video because
Yeah.
in and I look at this through like a business lens and a professional services lens. The mere exposure effect of your face on a screen repetitively, like people like scroll and they see your face, and they scroll and they see your face again. The mere exposure effect of your face builds familiarity, which is a stepping stone to trust, which we talked about earlier is a key part of developing new business. So that's number one, is the mere exposure effect of your face. YouTube has insane organic reach. So does TikTok. And as a discovery, if you're focused on growing your show and getting more people to discover your show, those are two platforms that I would highly recommend. And it's not just for Gen Z. That's the key point.
Right.
I was talking with Brett Trainer, who runs the Corporate Escapee podcast, and his mission is to help 10,000 Gen Xers escape the corporate grind and start their own business. And his number one, he's got like 30,000 followers on TikTok. And these are Gen X people that are finding him on TikTok and subscribing to his podcast and engaging in his community. So I think
Wow.
I just want to dispel that myth that there's only young people on TikTok. That's not the case at all.
Yeah, I love the interaction. I love how they serve their creators as well. Like they really help promote what you do. If you're active, like you can't post one TikTok and then never come back.
Right.
It's just never going to work that way. You got to be
Just
active.
like any
You got to be there.
platform.
Right. And I know that every platform prefers you to use their tools instead of just creating one thing and plastering it everywhere.
Yeah.
They really do like you to use their tools. So kind of a little hint to everybody, if you're going to create on a platform, when they offer up a new tool, a new feature, a new thing, they would probably reward people who use the new thing because they've created this new feature, right? So be looking out for those new things that pop up. They're really interesting.
Maybe that's a goal for me, is to experiment with some of the on-platform features of TikTok and maybe streaming from YouTube and things like that.
Okay, so I want to help as many podcasters through this show by bringing great people like you on. What else from the podcasting space can we help a new podcaster in 2025 either start or grow their show? I would love to talk a little bit more about branding as well for podcasting from your perspective. But where do you want to go in the conversation next?
Yeah, well, I think let's kind of find the overlap there. For folks that are entering the podcast space, sometimes there is a narrow focus on launching an interview show, and that may be the right way to go. It may not be the right way to go. And I would recommend anyone who's considering a podcast to really reflect on your own personality and then structure your show to maximize your personality. So, for example, are you really good at reading off a script and acting? Then maybe like a shorter monologue type of show is right for you, right? Maybe you have really good banter and chemistry with another consultant in the industry. And so a co-hosted commentary style show might be great fit for you two to capture that chemistry. Or maybe you are an introvert, but you listen really, really well and you ask really good questions and you're able to really engage in the conversation. Then maybe an interview show is right for you too. So like there's a number of different directions you can go in structuring your podcast to maximize your personality.
That's probably why I have 8 different podcasts that I host, because I find that they're all different. And like I have a children's podcast. It's a Christmas countdown to Christmas with Santa. And it's me and a bunch of AI voices. And it's a whole world for kids. Like that's a completely different thing that I'm doing with you right now. Then there's solo episodes. There's like our author podcast. It's all interviews because I'm not an author as the host of the show. So I have no idea how to write a book. But I just bring on experts who write books and I just ask them the questions.
That's a great way to learn.
From a point of view of somebody who just wants to know, right? For my audience who maybe you're just starting to write, or they're a reader and they have no desire to write. So I don't want to be a show about how to write a book. And I have nothing to add to the conversation because I've never done it. So I keep asking simple questions that most of my guests have never been asked before because they're usually interviewed by a fellow author. So you don't have to explain anything, right? So I get to do something a little different. And the look on their faces as guests, they're like, I never get to talk about this stuff. This is great, right? Because I don't know what I don't know. So I just keep bringing those things up. So all my shows are different, and I get to leverage a different muscle in podcasting by having the variety of different shows. So that's a good point. That's been my problem. I have too many shows, too many at 8. Yeah.
I've only got 2 that I host, and I think that's a lot. I couldn't imagine hosting 8 podcasts.
No. Well, November was podcast post month, that challenge to do 30 episodes in 30 days.
Yeah.
So three of my shows participated.
Jeez.
So that was 90 episodes went out in November. So yeah.
That's hats off to you.
See,
yeah.
I did start in August though, just to get ready for November. That's how far back I went. But yeah.
Well, I think that's another point too. Like folks that are just starting out is, the backlog of episodes and maintaining consistency. That's such a key part. I run I produce a show called the Ground Transportation Podcast. And it's, there's a financial analyst for the transportation industry. And then there is a driver training platform owner for the transportation industry. And they teamed up for this podcast. And we structured the show to release episodes twice monthly. So two times a week, every other week. And we were recording episodes every Friday. Sometimes we would double up and record one and then record another. It was a mix of interviews and co-hosted commentary style episodes. And we found that our backlog was getting we had so many episodes in our inventory that we were like, we need to switch to weekly. And so we switched to a weekly cadence, and then we're releasing those episodes, and we found that guests on the show were waiting entirely too long before their episode was published. It was sometimes 3 months. Right. And we're like, we need to change this. And so we kind of throttled back on the number of episodes we were recording. But that's just part of the process. I mean, having more episodes in your inventory and sitting on, that's a good problem to have. Versus, being starved for content and not being able to meet any sort of consistency because you don't have the inventory to be able to release. So that's something that I would recommend is always be thinking about how can you extend your runway.
So for your podcasting and professional services, how far out are you at any given time for your show?
Well, That one I recently kind of ran out of inventory, and that was by design because
Okay.
my guests were waiting too long. And so recently I kind of reset everything. And maybe that's again like a goal for 25 is to reduce the time between recording and publishing. So now I kind of reset that, and I'm calling it season 2 of the show in 25. And so that will be a little bit more rapid release for the show. Right now, I think I've got 2 episodes in my inventory, and a couple of other recordings coming up, including one with yourself, David. So,
Yay.
folks that
Yes.
are
Sweet.
listening, tune in to my conversation with David to hear about his experience.
Well, I feel like I've snuck in and I didn't get caught because you have so many great guests on. It's like, and then Dave. So I'm really looking forward to being on your show. That'd be fun.
Well, it's I find it interesting because I love to have a variety of voices on the show who add different perspectives on podcasting, and so
Mm.
you offer a very unique take on podcasting because you host 8 different shows. There are a number of different formats and varieties, so I think my listeners can find a lot of value in that from just kind of like your focus on podcasts.
Let's talk more about the branding side too.
Yeah,
But for me, again, because I have 8 different shows, I basically have 8 different brands that I'm
yeah.
operating at the same time. Can you, for a new podcaster who's just starting, can you quickly define for us what a brand is and what a brand is not, so that we can just kind of have like a foundation for the conversation? But explain brand to us. What is this thing?
Yeah, I think we talked about it a little bit earlier, and so we can expand on
Yeah.
that. I look at brand, your brand's strength, the strength of your brand as a product of your reputation and your visibility. So,
Okay.
what you mentioned earlier, like if you were to step out in the hallway and then there was a room of all of your peers and colleagues, what would they be saying about you while you're in the hallway? And so again, it's like, what do your listeners say about your podcast after they listen to an episode? And so I'd say that's your reputation.
Okay.
And the what you have to control that is obviously the content that you're putting out, the topics that you're talking about on your episodes. Are they relevant to your audience? Does your audience care about that? And in order to find that out, you need to be in touch with your listeners. You need to be engaged with them and have some sort of a feedback loop, whether that's, email surveys that are going out, or you have what I call a focus group for your listeners. So you can have a Mount Rushmore of listeners. There's like 5 folks that are like completely dedicated to your
Mm,
show, right? And
I
you
like
reach
that.
out to
I
them
like
every other month or something. And you're like, hey,
that.
what did you like about, the last batch of episodes? What didn't you like? What can I do better? Those kinds of questions and that kind of engagement with your listeners will help you make those small adjustments over time to improve the quality of your show, which will improve your reputation. So that's that side of the equation.
Okay. So on that, how do you find those Mount Rushmore listeners? Any tips?
Yeah, you can look for signals. So, for example, I run one of my shows, Breaking Biz Dev. It's a niche show, so we talk about sales and marketing for professional services firms, and we post regular clips on LinkedIn. We have a LinkedIn company page for the podcast, so we're able to tag the show when on LinkedIn. We're able to have that link, Breaking Biz Dev, and it's blue, and folks can click on it. And on that page, we post those short video clips,
Yeah.
and we'll see, the same groups of names of people who like and comment on those videos. So that would be one signal that tells us, okay, these guys are engaged, they're listening. Another signal is reviews that are left. And so we'll see
Right.
people leave reviews for the show. And by the way, if you're listening to this, leave David a review on How to Podcast on Apple, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts.
There you go. Love it. Thank you. Very well done. Well done. Well done.
But that's another place because that's real feedback. Did they give you a 5-star rating? Did they give you a 1-star rating? Do they need to like make a drastic change? So those are like 2 different examples of feedback loops.
Okay. So would a brand then, to kind of expand on that, is a brand a logo, a color, a font? Is that part of a brand? Is that at all part of the brand? How would you explain that?
Yeah, I think a brand is worth more than the sum of its parts. So a
Okay.
logo absolutely contributes to a brand. Your color scheme, sure, that's part of the design aesthetic of your brand, and then you can get into, blue means trust and green means
Yeah.
environmental and all that, happy stuff.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, it's really boils down to your podcast brand is a product of your reputation and visibility. And so we talked about the reputation side of the coin, the visibility side of the coin, and that's where I think like logo and aesthetic visual appeal plays a role. But there's also things like we talked about the mere exposure effect, and so that's why consistency is important, not just in
Yeah.
publishing episodes, but promoting your episodes and doing
Right.
that consistently. Do you have an email newsletter that goes out with every episode? Do you have a system to promote your podcast on social media? Are you asking people to on your podcast? Are you saying, "Hey, refer a friend"? Like folks that are listening to this right now, like if you find David's podcast episodes helpful, like tell a friend. That word of
Right.
mouth is really really helpful. So, and then calling that out on your podcast regularly is another kind of touch point on that journey to call people to action. So the more visibility that your show has within your total addressable market, that's that other side of the coin.
One thing I started early in 2024 on meetup.com was just a podcaster meetup. And we started with every Saturday morning, and now we've added Tuesday afternoon as well, because we have people in the UK and stuff that want to join in. And we get together like every week, and it's just a podcaster uh, meetup. We do every 3 times a month. We have a theme, something we're going to talk about, and then the last Saturday of the month is just open Q&A. But the whole idea is just building community
Mm-hmm.
with the people who listen to the show. So I actually get to see my listeners on the screen, and we talk about past episodes. I have them on my show, and this whole getting beyond talking to your monitor and talking to a microphone and actually seeing the eyeballs of the people who listen to your show
Yeah.
is just the coolest thing ever to do that kind of stuff. So anything we can do to build community around our podcast, I think would be another great feature or focus for 2025. Do you have any community elements to your show or to any of the other shows you work on?
The only one that I can think of right now, well, for me personally, I'm still building my shows, and I'm still kind of very much in a growth mode. I guess like I'm starting to like build community naturally on LinkedIn, I
Yeah.
suppose. That's kind of naturally where I'll hang out, and that's where my audience mostly hangs out. But the corporate escapee is just keeps coming to mind as a podcast that
Yeah.
I interviewed Brett on my show, and his Slack group launched within the last year, so up to a year old, and it's grown like bananas. And it's crazy. And it's, he's helping Gen Xers escape the corporate grind. And he's got, over
Mm-hmm.
1,000 people in his Slack community now. And it's
It's
just,
amazing.
it's incredible. The connections that he's made, and the folks that are, who resonate with his message, and, are just so fed up with, the corporate world that they're willing to take the risk to go out on their own. And they've got this resource of other people who are in the same exact situation, and folks can crowdsource knowledge about how to do that and how to become their own business owners and entrepreneurs. So that would be the one example that really stands out in my mind.
I do love the whole idea of adding more video to podcasts. I know a lot of people love the audio space. It's kind of like if you compare it back to the old radio days, you'd hear your favorite DJ on the radio in the morning drive, and you kind of make a mental picture of what you think they look like,
Yeah.
and then you meet them in real life. You're like, oh, you're shorter than I thought you were. You're like, wow, that big voice came from that little body. Wow, it was amazing. But I guess they never, in traditional radio back in the day, they never, the whole idea of video was never really a big thing because they're a radio person. It's a
Right.
radio personality, right? I love the idea that we can leverage podcasting with the audio side and then complement it with the video side. I think that's one thing that I will need to do more on my show is kind of leverage that to better extend that as well. It's a great addition to the podcast. I I haven't seen a great return on investment for a talking head video for 45 minutes or an hour on YouTube. I find that doesn't really my retention levels kind of drop off after a while. I
Yeah.
don't really get a big return on that, but I do love the clips and bringing out key moments that add value in the moment without having to give further context. Like you actually walk away with something from that clip, like you did earlier. That was a perfect clip, right? You had everything there for somebody. You don't have to go to the episode, but you're going to get something from it just because of what happened in that moment. So for me, that's one of my focuses in 2025. I would say as well is trying to leverage more video and try to make that connection better.
Are you set up operationally to be able to do that?
Yeah, it's more time
Yeah.
for me. I do have a job as well, so I'm balancing a work-life balance type thing. So I would love to do more. It's just going to be some creative calendar work to make that work.
Sure. I understand that for sure.
As we kind of wrap up, John, for the podcaster listening again, I just really want to encourage them that you might be just starting out. You might be trying to grow your show, find new listeners. Anything beyond word of mouth marketing that you would suggest to somebody around the growth of their show or getting their show out into the world? Any other opportunities that you see that you would tell your team or your podcasters to maybe leverage for their shows?
Build systems. That's the best.
Okay.
That's the best thing. Reinventing the wheel every time that you publish a new episode is so tiring. But if you can, even if it's just copy templates for a social media post that has all like the bones of what you would need, and then
Great.
you're editing, 2 or 3 lines instead of creating, a whole post for, as a caption for your video snippet. So that would be like the biggest thing is if you're just starting out, like constantly be thinking about how can I templatize? How can I systematize? How can I turn this into a repeatable process? And if you do that, you'll find that you'll be able to maintain the consistency that you need to sustain over a long period of time. Like we're talking years here. And so you need to have those systems in place so that you can be in podcasting for the long haul.
I'm going to throw this at you with no warning
Sure.
to see how you are on your feet.
All right.
All right. I'll do it
I'm ready.
first to give you a moment to think. Okay. My quote of the year for 2025 that I'm really trying to put into practice. It's a quote by Theodore Roosevelt. It basically says, do what you can with what you have where you are. Do what you can with what you have where you are. For podcasters, do what you can with the tools that you have where you are right now. Instead of waiting to be like the most knowledgeable person in podcasting
Yeah.
before you hit record, just go. Like you have enough to go. Just get going, right?
Whether it's an iPhone and you're just recording your thoughts on an iPhone, well, you don't need the fancy mic. I've been in podcasting for 5 years and, just like within the last year, I got this Shure MV7 mic, which I love, by the way. But before that, it was just, an old Shure mic from like my musician days, right? With an
Right.
XLR cable into a mixer. And there was like this little noise in the background. And, like you said, you do what you can with what you have where you are. I love that.
There you go. So do you have a quote that you think of or is posted by your computer or on the wall somewhere, something that kind of rattles around in your brain and you're like, oh, this is something that really means something to me?
I mean, get 1% better every day is just something that is a constant mantra for me. But because we were talking about feedback, I think, one quote from, I believe it's Edward Deming's, when it comes to, or how does it go? Here it is. Quantitative is watching the dashboard while you drive. Qualitative is looking out the window. And what that means is like we were talking about feedback and signals, and there are signals that you can get from, your analytics that show, total downloads for this episode. Wow, what went into that? Was it the topic? Was it the guest? Those are quantitative, and that's your dashboard. Qualitative feedback is when a listener reaches out to you and says, I loved your last episode with so-and-so. It gave me a whole new perspective, and I'm trying this new thing. That's qualitative feedback. And so the combination of those two if you can kind of balance both sides of that scale, I think that's kind of like, those are the best signals to watch out for. But you have to have both of them. It can't just be one or the other.
Amazing. See, that's gold too. There's another clip right there. That's perfect. I love it, John. Okay, remind John about your shows and your business as well. Let's do all that as we wrap up.
Sure. Yeah. So if you want to hear examples of business podcasters, check out Podcasting and Professional Services. If you're in a professional services firm and you want to get better at business development, check out Breaking Biz Dev. And if you're thinking about launching a show for your business, check out redcedarmarketing.com and connect with me on LinkedIn.
Beautiful.
That's where I like to hang out.
They're great podcasts, everyone. You got to go listen. John, thank you so much for making time to do this. Happy New Year to you and your family, and looking forward to keeping me company with your shows as I work. So thank you for doing that. And again, thank you so much for doing this on the show today.
Thank you, David. I'm looking forward to our conversation on podcasting and professional services. And I think we've got a meeting lined up in the next week or so. So looking forward to that.
Sounds great. I can't wait to be there. It'll be fun. Thanks, John.
Cheers.
Hey, thanks for listening to the podcast all the way through to the end. I love having these great guest co-hosts on the show to share their podcast with you. You have some homework to do. And what I'm asking of you is to go check out our featured guest co-host today. Go over and listen to their podcast. The links are always in the show notes. I'd love for you to go and give them your love and support. And I think if we can all do that for each other, podcasting will be a lot more fun for all of us. So it's time to do what you've asked others to do for you. It's time to do for this guest co-host. Links in the show notes. Go over and check out their show and leave them a review, do the follow, go listen to their episodes in full, the entirety of an episode, which again shows to the apps that it's a good podcast because you're going there and you're staying to the end. It's probably one of the best ways you can help a podcaster grow their audience and be shown to more people is by simply going and listening wherever you listen to the very end, like you're doing right now here. This is the perfect way to signal to wherever you're listening on, this is a podcast worth promoting. And all of the apps want you to stay on as long as possible. So go over and listen to our guest co-host episode and leave them some feedback. If they have a buy me a coffee, send them a coffee. If they have a speak pipe, send them a voice message. If they have an email, send them an email. If they're on Instagram, send them a direct message. Do something to support our guest co-hosts. They've given up their time to be here with you, to be here with me. And we can give that back to them with time and attention, our love, our support. Thank you for doing all that for me as well. Here on the How to Podcast series, we'll talk to you soon for our next episode.